Question number 12, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr Speaker, this question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, does he stand by all his statements, and if so, why?
The Honourable Bill English.
Yes, Mr Speaker, in the context which I made.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Does he stand by his statement in a response letter to my OIA request dated 17 August 2015 that, quotes, the documents alleged to contain the information requested do not exist, end of quotes?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, I can't respond on the specific statement because I don't know what he's referring to, but generally we would stand by the statements that I make in letters in response to the OIA.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
If that is the case, then why do I have a copy of a letter signed by him on 26 March 2013 to Federated Farmers that contradicts his statement that the documents do not exist and makes a mockery of the OIA process?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, I don't know the answer to that question. If we endeavour to comply at all times with the OIA, in fact, in my office and in the Treasury, we're probably among the more proactive releases of public information in the whole public service.
Order.
Point of order, the Right Honourable Winston
Speaker,
Peters.
I seek to table 3 letters. One's dated 26 March 2013 from Bruce Wills, Federated Farmers. The second one is a letter, the 13th of March rather, 2013 from Bill English as well I'll rephrase this. Mr Wills' letter, 13th of February 2013 to Bill English. Mr English's reply, 26th of March 2013, and then his reply to us, or me, 17th of August 2015. That's 3 letters.
Leave us sought to table those 3 particular letters. Is there any objection to them being tabled? There is none. They can be tabled. Point of order, Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's my understanding that in questions to ministers, that as soon as ministers become aware that they have given an incorrect answer in Parliament, they should raise that at the earliest opportunity.
Order.
I've waited to the end of question time to hear a correction from Michael Woodhouse to question 8 last week.
Order. The member's in danger of creating disorder. That is not an appropriate use of the point of order. If the member feels there's been misrepresentation made in this House, she knows the appropriate course. If she doesn't, she needs to refer to standing orders. We move now to point of order, the Honourable Gerry.
Mr Speaker, I've waited at the end of questions to ministers. There were 2 questions today that I'd ask you to have a look at the verification for, question 4 and question 11, where there were the questions are based on quotes allegedly made by the ministers, but both refuted by the ministers. It would be interesting to know why the Clerk's Office accepted those when clearly they weren't quotes attributable to the ministers.
Order.
Because
No, just a minute. I'm calling the Honourable David Parker to respond to that point of order.
I can assist, sir, because we provided documentary proof in support of those quotes.
Order. Order. I will have a look at. I will have a look at the information used to justify both those questions. I can't answer it, obviously, at the moment. Often those quotes are not particularly attributed to a member, but they still may be a quote attributed to somebody, and that is sufficient verification for a question to be allowed. But order, I will look at it more deeply before I respond to the member.
Speaker, could I just...
Is this a fresh point of order?
It is an addition to the point of order. It's not a challenge.
Order. I've ruled that I'll look into the matter if there's a fresh point of order.
You listened to something that I think was quite unreasonable from the member.
Order. The member will resume his seat. The member raised a point of order. I allowed the Honourable David Parker to respond to it to help me in making my mind. I will have a look at further information to see whether those 2 questions submitted were satisfactorily verified. We move now to questions to members. Question number 1,